Well, hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Justin, of course, you know me, but I want to welcome E. Bello, who is coming for this week's Wellness Wednesday series. And we're yeah. So the presentation will be Understanding Grief, Supporting Our Neighbors and Ourselves. Is with Transitions Life Care. They're a grief outreach coordinator. And they've been there a little over 2 years at Transitions, but has also other experience with Duke Hospice and some other things. And they will let us know a little bit about that. But let's give a warm welcome to E. Bello, and thank you for coming out today.
Thank you. I'm going to readjust. I'm a little bit shorter than Justin. There we go. Well, welcome everybody. As Justin said, my name is E. Bello. You didn't bless you. You didn't mishear it. It really is just as simple as that. It's just the letter E. But I'm the grief outreach coordinator at Transitions Life Care. I've been doing grief and death and dying for about 10 years now, and I've been with Transitions for the last about 3.5 in this particular role. But at Transitions, we provide grief support to adults as well as children. We do so at no cost. We don't require insurance, but we have everything from individual counseling to support groups to things like expressive arts and mindfulness-based groups. We even have a group that meets twice a month at the Art Museum for a grief walk. So we try to make sure that there's a little something for everyone. But I would love to know just who's in this space with us today. We're talking about something that is really intimate, really personal. And so if you are comfortable, I would love to know what your name is. And if you're here remembering someone or someone's, I would love to know what their name was and who they were to you. Yes. Sure, absolutely. You take your time. And that goes for everybody. If you need something today to take care of yourself, if you need to get a glass of water, get up and stretch, if you need to walk around or leave entirely, please know you have permission to do that and to take care of yourselves however you need to today. But I would love to just know who's in this space with us, not just the faces that I'm looking at, but who you might be carrying with you. If you do not feel comfortable talking or sharing, you can look to your neighbor to your side and just say, pass, and that's okay. Carrie, can I pick on you just as a model to go first? Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Welcome. That's okay. Justin.
I'm Justin. I have a grief anniversary coming up. My dad died a couple of years ago at the end of this month, and so this coming up,
Yeah. Thanks, Justin. Of course, in the periphery. Justin's remembering his dad and that anniversary that's coming up. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Zelda, and I took care of my husband for 7 years. He died 4 years ago. I also have a master's degree in social work.
Wonderful.
So whenever I hear about these kind of lectures, I just feel like it's continuing education.
Wonderful. No pressure to me as a fellow social worker. Welcome, Zelda. Thank you. Mm-hmm. 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 Mm. Of course. Thank you, Judith. Judith is remembering her daughter and her dear friend. Thank you. It's okay. Would you like to introduce yourself? Yes.
I'm Charmaine, and I'm here because my brother died 19 months ago, and when we moved here, my brother was in Raleigh,
Mhm.
and we just thought we'd have time together.
Absolutely. Remembering your brother today. Thank you.
I'm Sharon Purdue, and I had a husband that passed away after we moved in here in September, and passed away outside the walkway thing, and had a stroke. And so I was very interested, and they took us to, that was in September, and January, he passed away. And I'm trying to get myself acclimated, and if it hadn't been for transitions, I would never have been as calm as I was because of the way it was all handled. So
Thank you.
I really don't have enough to say about them. So
Thank you so much. I promise we did not plug her in here. She sounds like an advertisement.
But I did, and it was really tough, and
Yeah.
I wouldn't have been able to do as well and feel like the Lord was with me if it hadn't been for the way they were treating me.
Certainly. Thank you, and thank you for trusting us with his care. Thanks for being here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Doug, and coming up on the anniversary of loved one.
Mm-hmm.
And I also was hoping to get some strategies about how to support others that
Absolutely.
are going through it, because that's often difficult to help others.
Certainly. Thanks so much, Doug. And we will definitely be talking about getting into some strategies on how to cope with our own grief as well as how to support others today. Thanks for being here. And my friend in the back, would you like to introduce yourself? Yes.
Yes.
Welcome to.
My name is Jim. I lost my wife 3 years ago after an 11-year struggle with Alzheimer's dementia. She was under hospice care the last few days. I also lost a 27-year-old son in 1992, and he was under hospice care for the last few days of his life as well.
Thank you so much for being here. All those layers of loss. Thank you. And my two friends in the back, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Wanda Ikoff, and I lost my husband almost 30 years ago. And I am still, it's
Yeah.
just understanding why that happened so many years ago. And I just feel like if I have a better understanding, perhaps I can even help somebody else when they're going through it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Wanda. I appreciate that perspective. And we will be talking a lot about why do we continue to grieve a year, 5 years, 30 years later, and how can we support others? Yeah.
I moved when I lost my husband, 5 years ago in April. And it was at the time of COVID, so
Mhm.
you sort of had to go through this yourself.
Yeah.
But I have a very strong, abiding faith, so I got through that period.
Yeah, she was saying the added layer of COVID and how that added layer of isolation and loneliness and how that impacts our grief. Certainly. Is there anyone that we haven't heard from who would like to introduce themselves? Yes. Yes, if you'd like to let us know your name and if there's someone that you're remembering today.
Yes, I'm Kristen Hemmer, and I'm grieving for my sister who died 7 years ago. She was my best friend, and she died in a memory care unit. And I think about her a lot. I dream about her a whole lot,
Yeah.
almost every night.
Thank you, Gretchen. Remembering your, yes.
Well, I should say that both my parents died in a hospice care place.
Mhm.
and it was really wonderful.
Mm, yeah, a very different experience, I imagine. Yeah. And Gretchen's remembering her sister and best friend as well as her parents. Well, for all of those names that were spoken and unspoken, we remember them today, and we invite them into this space today as we talk about how our grief and their lives, their love continue to impact us, whether it's been 6 months or 30 years. And so today we'll be talking about a variety of different topics. We'll be talking about what is grief, maybe more importantly, what grief isn't, how it impacts our bodies, our behaviors, our spirits. I'll talk a little bit about grief theory. I promise I won't be too heady about it, but I think it's really helpful just to have some context for better understanding our grief and why we grieve for so long. And finally, as many of you talked about, your desired outcome for the day is, how do I hold this? How do I support the people around me, my neighbors, my community? And of course, there'll be a little bit of a closing. I might give you a little bit of homework. I love homework, so bear with me. But to get started, I want to start by talking about what is grief. And that probably sounds like a really silly question because we all, as you've noted, we've all grieved. We've all experienced a death or a loss. But I think there are a lot of misunderstandings or myths about grief that I think could use some debunking. So we're going to do a little bit of that today. But to get started, I think it's really important to parse the difference between words like grief and mourning. These two words that we use pretty interchangeably, right? But actually refer to two very different experiences. So when we're talking about grief, we're talking about an internal experience. We're using this really simple 5-letter word to try to describe a cauldron of wide-ranging and wildly ranging experiences that are physical and emotional and mental, cognitive, spiritual at times. Whereas mourning is external. It's what people see when we're grieving. The tears, the memorials, the laying of flowers on a grave. It's the things that people see when we're grieving. But when we think about grief, 90% of that experience is just below the surface. It's underneath the water. Nobody sees it except for the person experiencing it. And that's why when we see somebody who maybe has just lost a spouse, and maybe you see them at the grocery store, in the parking lot, or even in church, and they're upright, they've left the house, maybe they've actually combed their hair, maybe put on some makeup even, and we think, gosh, they look like they're doing pretty well, they must be okay. But underneath that is the experience of grief. It's that 90% that we know nothing about because we aren't them. We can't know it. Rabbi Earl Grolman says that grief isn't a disorder. It's not a disease or a sign of weakness. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price that you pay for love. And he says, ironically, the only cure for grief is to grieve. And so if we break that down, what Rabbi Grolman shared, we know that it's not a disease, it's not a weakness. Instead, it's a really natural and human response to loss. It's what it means to be fully human and to have loved someone so deeply that you want that connection, you want that love to continue, even in your grief, even here. And it's also incredibly necessary. As he said, the only cure for grief is to grieve. That is the only way to explore our grief, to process our grief, is to be able to give it a little bit of space, some oxygen to breathe in. And it's not a problem to solve. It's not something that we can fix. It's something that we carry. It's a process to tend to. And it takes a while, and it takes what it takes. There's no timeline on grief. I think a lot of people think that after 6 months or a year, we should be, quote unquote, back to normal, right? but normal is shattered. Anytime we experience a death or a loss, there is no normal here. And there's no timeline. That can be really confusing and difficult because of that. It's also incredibly individual. Even if we're grieving the same person, say a spouse and a daughter are grieving their husband and their father, that relationship with that person looked different when they were living. And so our grief is going to look different as well. I often use this idea of overlapping circles to explain why people might experience grief differently. So it's this idea of how much we overlap or intersect. So say maybe a neighbor and you might intersect a little bit, maybe during neighborhood functions or when you take the dog out for a walk. But imagine a parent and a child, or a spouse and a partner, and how deeply they intersect and overlap, likely almost entirely. Again, that's why we grieve so differently, even if we're grieving the same person. That relationship looks different. As Mitch Albom said, if you've ever read Tuesdays with Morrie, he says that death ends a life. It doesn't end a relationship. And so our grief is this process of internalizing that relationship that was once external. So maybe this was the person that you woke up to every morning and you had coffee and a slow breakfast as you started your day, or maybe it was the person that you called on your drive home from work every day. That is a physical, external relationship. And our grief, much of it is this process of beginning to internalize that, of finding new ways to remain connected to them. And that's something that we'll build on in just a little bit. But again, it's this awareness of everything that's been taken from us, everything that's been stolen from us, often without our consent, to an awareness of everything that remains, everything that endures because that person existed, because they loved us, because they were in our lives. As I mentioned, grief, it's this process, this amalgamation of emotional and physical and mental and behavioral and spiritual changes. And I want to take some time today to just talk about what that's looked like for you, to take a sort of picture of this current version of you, where you are in your grief currently. You don't have to fix your hair or anything. You're already on camera, but it's not that kind of picture, but more of a metaphorical picture. So bear with me. Sorry if that screeches. I want to start by talking about how has our grief affected us? And we'll go through different aspects of our beings, of our lives. But starting with physical, how has your grief impacted you physically, in your body? What have you noticed in your body? And feel free to just shout it out.
My shoulders stay closer to my ears.
To your ears, absolutely. I had to roll mine back as I walked in here. She was saying her shoulders are all the way up at her ears. Absolutely. So physical, I'm putting tension in shoulders, up at ears. And if you can't see this, I promise I'll keep repeating myself. What other physical symptoms, things that happen in your body?
Sometimes you look over and you think you're talking to them, and you're such a habit of doing that sort of thing.
Yeah,
You don't realize, oh, he's not there.
absolutely.
It's kind of it's just a different feeling you have. You just haven't experienced it that far.
Certainly. She was saying, I noticed myself talking to my person, thinking that they're there physically, until I realized they're not physically there. And it's a really different feeling. Yeah. I'm actually going to put that one over here, under behavioral. What about other physical symptoms, things that are happening in your body? Don't feel like eating, yeah. I'm going to put plus or minus appetite. Sometimes we eat too little or too much or more than we're used to. Yeah. Speaking of eating, how about your stomach? What happens to your stomach? Maybe a knots, maybe nauseous. I see some nods, yeah. Other physical symptoms. How about your heart? Anything happen with your heart? Palpitations? Maybe it's beating fast. Yeah. Anybody have pain? More pain? Or how often do we have physical ailments before that get worse when we're grieving, especially if we're caregivers, right? Maybe we've put our own health needs to the background, or maybe we've been doing more lifting than we should. I see a lot of nods on that one. I'm going to put increased health issues. Any other physical changes? Well, how about emotional? We know there's sadness. That's the obvious one. But we know there's so much more than sadness when we're grieving. What other emotions or feelings?
Anger.
Anger, absolutely.
Anger at God, anger at the person who left you.
Absolutely, Gretchen. Anger in so many different directions, at God, at the person who left, maybe at the medical community, maybe the people who are still here that didn't step up in the way that you had hoped they would. And Gretchen, you don't have to answer this, but you're welcome to, anyone's welcome to answer this, but after you feel anger, is there another emotion that usually follows that pretty quickly afterward? Sadness, yeah. How about guilt? Anybody ever feel guilt or shame? Guilt, regret, yeah. Guilt, regret, maybe even shame. It's so normal when we're grieving to use the magnifying glass to go through all the little details. Was there something that I could have done or should have done? Did I make the right choices? And we often feel guilt, regret, shame. Guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is, I am bad. I think the difference between guilt and regret, guilt is, I knew that I shouldn't have done this and I did it anyway, whereas regret is, if I knew what the outcome was going to be, I would have done this differently. How about other emotions? Other feelings? Fear, yeah. Fear. Yeah. From a lot of different directions, yeah. What's next? Who might be next? Yeah. Will I ever feel any better? Will I love this way again? Maybe fear of being alone, especially if you've lost a partner. Yeah. Anyone else? Other emotions? Overwhelmed, yes, definitely. She was saying overwhelmed. Yeah, overwhelmed by the sheer grief, the heaviness, the burden of it, not to mention the tangible stuff. They do not tell you how much paperwork is needed after somebody dies. Yeah, it's overwhelming. Anyone else? Yes.
Relief.
Thank you. I was waiting for somebody to say that.
After 11 years of watching your spouse die, it was a relief to know that she was no longer in pain
Yeah,
and had been released.
absolutely. And not everyone will feel that. Not everyone will experience relief. But I always wait until the last minute just to see if somebody else is going to mention it first. So I thank you for your vulnerability, your honesty. That's a really hard thing to name. It feels really taboo to say, I feel relief that my person isn't physically here anymore. That doesn't take the grief away. It doesn't mean I don't wish with every fiber of my being that they were here. And oftentimes we do feel relief because there's no pain, no suffering, or even on our own end as caregivers. The burden of caregiving is too much for one person to deal with. And so often there is relief. But again, just like anger, what comes after you say that? Guilt, shame, right? So I appreciate that vulnerability. There is no shame in naming that. That is such a common response. Anyone else for emotional? Cheated. Yes. Gosh, I got goosebumps when you said that. Cheated. Yeah.
It was my husband's two children called right as he was dying.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a chance to say anything.
Yes, absolutely. She was saying her children called just as he was dying, and she didn't have the chance to say her goodbyes, to say what she wanted to say. Yeah, cheated of what could have been, of what should have been. How about jealousy? Anybody ever feel jealousy? Why my person? Where you are in the park and you see people holding hands, an older couple maybe. Why couldn't that be us? Why couldn't we have more time, more years? Anyone else? How about behavioral? We've got talking to my person. What other changes have you noticed in terms of how maybe you interact with other people or the world around you?
Well, I think from my own experience, it would be that it makes you more aware of what's going on around you and be more thoughtful about how you handle different parts of your life that you've had just kind of taken it, not thought about that.
Yeah.
And it makes you really think about other people and how you can help
Mm-hmm.
in some way.
Yes, certainly. She was saying more aware of what's going on around you, of other people who may be hurting. How can I be more empathic? How can I help others? Yeah. There's a book called It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine, and she's a clinician as well as somebody who has had a very traumatic loss of her partner. And as a clinician who counseled people who were grieving, she thought she knew what she was doing. She had wonderful clinical skills, and for the most part, she did, until she experienced her own very significant loss. And then she felt like she needed to call up every single one of her clients and say, I am so sorry. I had no idea what I was saying. We don't know until we know. And then we wish we didn't know, right? Yeah, but how we can maybe support others who are grieving. I'm going to put increased awareness. Anyone else? How about crying? I know that's an obvious one. I'm going to put that. Increased crying.
You try to stay busy sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Stay busy. Busying yourself. Distracting yourself. Anybody?
Sleep
Yes, not sleeping, or maybe sleeping more. And same with appetite. I could go in here too. How about more fights, more tension in your relationships with people? Everything maybe feels a little petty compared to what you're experiencing. Anybody withdraw? Isolate yourself. Maybe you were fairly social before or not, but now you just too much of anybody. Yeah. Or maybe the opposite. I don't want to be alone. It's too quiet. Anything else for behavioral? We've got two more. How about mental? We've talked about emotional, but when I say mental, I mean more cognitive. What's happening in your brain? Or what more likely what's not happening in your brain? Yes.
So, particularly the first year, of course, I was like thinking about the stages of grief. And I'm really like I had a check off list. Okay, I've done that one, I've done that one, I've done that one.
We'll get to
And I
that.
realized that grief is very sneaky.
Yeah.
That just when you think you've got it pretty much covered, it'll just surprise you. And I will get emotional about something that we're like, what brought that on?
Yes, yes.
That really caught me by surprise.
Yeah. What she was referring to are grief triggers or grief bursts, as many of us call them. Of, I think I'm doing all right. I'm going through the motions. Maybe I'm having one of those good days, and I'm at the grocery store checking things off my list. Look at me go. And then you walk down the snack aisle, and you see your person's favorite cookie, and you realize, I didn't have to put that on my list this time. And it all comes flooding back. Or maybe it's a scent or a smell or a song. Sometimes our bodies don't even, our minds don't realize it, but just the time of year. Our bodies somehow innately know that there's an anniversary coming upon us. Yeah. I'm going to put that could go anywhere, honestly. I'm going to put it here. Grief bursts. Other cognitive or mental changes.
Thing I would think it would be important, people keep stressing, especially in the physician's area, exercise to take your mind off it when you're getting down and feel like you're getting depressed about something, do something different.
Sure.
Like exercise, they really stress doing some type of exercise.
Absolutely.
And I don't mean, you need to be walking.
Don't go run a marathon. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's supposed to be very good for helping when you're thinking about
Certainly. And exercise, I don't like to prescribe anything, especially with grief, because again, it's not a disease or disorder. But exercise, of course, can help stimulate our brains. It can help. There's something called bilateral stimulation that happens in our brain, especially when we do things like walking or hiking, when we're looking both directions and processing. This bilateral stimulation, it helps to calm our central nervous systems and help decrease our physiological, our physical, and our emotional arousal. And it helps to aid healing. Yeah. Other brain changes. What's happening in your brain or not happening in your brain? Yes. Less bandwidth, more confusion. Yep. How about forgetfulness? Does that fall in there? Yeah. Forgetfulness. I walked into this room What did I walk into this room for? Yeah. So much about grief is about survival, getting through one breath to the next, 15 minutes to the next. And so things like, where did I put my keys, go to the back of our brain. Unless we're being chased, where our keys are, probably not about survival, right? Yeah. It's what we lovingly refer to as grief brain. Any other brain changes? Well, how about spiritual? And when I say spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious or dogmatic, though it certainly could be, but more that existential part of you, those big questions that you ask yourself. What changes have you noticed there? What big questions do you find yourself asking? Yeah.
Well, I have to go back to anger because I was angry with God.
Yeah.
Because in the case of my 27-year-old son who died of brain cancer, and then this was 33 years ago, to put it in perspective, I said to myself, why did David die? I mean, he wouldn't hurt a fly, but here's Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, all of these people who are still alive.
Yeah.
I didn't understand that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hear anger with God. And why? Why me? Why my son? Why now? Why this way? Yeah. Just going to put anger with God and why. Yeah. About your identity. What happens to your identity when somebody you love dies? I saw a lot of sighs when I said that. Yeah. Our people are our mirrors. They tell us about ourselves. They tell us who we are. They help to identify us to ourselves and to the world. And so when they die, often part of us dies with them. We lose ourselves. Who am I? What's my meaning? What's my purpose? I'm going to put identity, meaning, purpose. Gretchen, I heard you say earlier that you had dreams about your sister. How many other folks have dreams or visitations or feel like your person is visiting you in some way? Or signs that you see? You know, people sometimes look at butterflies or cardinals and think, there's my person. Yeah. I'm going to add to it dreams, visitations. Anything else that folks would add to our board? Anything we haven't added yet for any part of our being?
Sometimes some people have seen the person, ghosts, if you want to call it. And I had an experience like that. I was lying in bed and woke up in the middle of the night, and somebody walked in the room and turned around the bathroom. And she had a nightie on, just like my sister. And I could feel the little breeze that goes by when somebody goes by. After that, I think she visited me 2 more times. When I was sleeping, she would put her hand on my shoulder like that to sort of comfort me. And I tell people that a lot because a lot of people think it's a lot of baloney. But there are I found lots of people
Yeah.
who had dreams like that. And it's, I felt really honored that it happened to me.
Certainly. She was describing this feeling or experience where her sister visited her. It felt like she felt a breeze against her nightgown or maybe a hand on the shoulder, and that you felt honored. It sounds like it wasn't a scary experience, but a comfort to know that she felt safe to come visit you, to return. Yeah, I hear so many of those stories. I had a dear friend whose sister died, and she found pennies everywhere she went. Even in the shower, she found a penny. I mean, just the strangest places, one in the freezer where you wouldn't find pennies. And it was just this sign. She felt like her sister was visiting her and just letting her know, I'm okay, I'm safe. Yeah, these dreams, visitations. Well, all of these things, we could go on indefinitely about how our grief has impacted us. And each of your diagrams, each of your boards would look so differently. But these are all very common experiences in grief. I hesitate to use the word normal for much of anything in life because I don't want to trivialize it. I know that this doesn't feel normal. This doesn't feel like your normal self. And these are all very common experiences in grief. I wanted to mention something. There was someone over here that was talking about, 30 years out. Why am I grieving as intensely as I am? And I wanted to go to the cognitive parts that we were talking about. There's a really incredible book by Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor called The Grieving Brain. She's a neuroscientist with an incredible repertoire and experience in her field. But she uses some different studies to try to explain what's going on in our brains when we're grieving. And I wanted to just briefly tell you about two that she mentions, because I think it will help to explain that experience a little bit. So the first study that she does, she has these mice in a maze, and she measures their neural pathways. So she's measuring what's going on in their brains. She does this, and then she builds a little Lego tower, and she drops that Lego tower in the maze. She again measures what's going on in the mice brains. And eventually, after some time, she removes that Lego tower out of that maze. And one more time, she measures what happens to the mice brains. So my question to you is, when she took that piece of plastic out, how long do you think it took for mice to forget a plastic Lego tower? Just ballpark guess. How long do you think it took for them to forget about a piece of plastic? Don't be shy. There are no wrong answers. A day. Thank you, Justin. So it actually took 11 days for mice to forget about a piece of plastic. So imagine now, add to that the relationships built up over time, the years, the joys, the intimacy, the fact that you all are not mice. That is why grief takes so long. Even for mice, it took 11 days just to forget about a piece of plastic. We don't forget about our people. We don't stop loving our people. And that's why we don't stop grieving them either. It's a lifelong process. There's another study that I'll just briefly mention. But in order to, maybe it's not a study so much as it's an anecdote. So to understand her anecdote, you have to assume this premise. And it's a little bit silly, but bear with me. She says, your kitchen table has been stolen. Your kitchen table has been stolen. So maybe you wake up in the middle of the night, you're thirsty, you go downstairs to get a glass of water, and you notice yourself walking around where that table should be. And you notice where your hip would normally hit the corner, that doesn't happen. Where you would normally stub your toe every morning on the leg, that doesn't happen either. That table is gone. And you realize it's in the absence and not the presence of something that you are walking this world in two different realities. This virtual reality in which we have stored these memories. It's helped us to navigate our life. And the physical reality that that table is gone. That table has been stolen from you. And that same premise applies to our grief. It's in the absence of our person that we realize we're walking in two different worlds. We're being forced to throw out this roadmap of that we have helped to navigate our lives, probably for years or decades or a lifetime, and to transform that physical relationship into an emotional relationship. That's a heck of a lot of work for our brains to do, right? Again, that's why we don't have the bandwidth. We're more confused. We're forgetful. We have grief bursts. We're walking around two worlds trying to navigate it. And grief, the things that make learning hard, make grief hard, and vice versa. Grief is just another version of learning to live in this world without our physical person. Another thing that I think is really helpful as we understand our grief is to begin to acknowledge the different layers of loss that we are experiencing, because I think most of us mistake the physical loss of our person as the only loss. But as each of you have noted, there are so many other layers. Things like loss of our companion, loss of our identity, dreams about the future. A little fun fact about myself. I should have told you this, Justin, when you were asking for fun facts about me. My first job as a kid, I worked at Hallmark. And so I am intimately aware of all the many ways to offer condolences and support to somebody who has experienced a loss. But not once since I was 13 years old have I gone to Hallmark and picked up a card that said, "I'm sorry for your loss of intimacy," or "I'm sorry for the loss of your fundamental belief system." These cards don't exist, right? These secondary losses, as we call them, are losses in and of themselves, in their own right. Maybe it's the loss of your partner or the person who took out the trash, right? Or your co-parent, whatever it may be. And grief, it doesn't happen in isolation. One loss can trigger memories about past losses. And so we're not just grieving the present, we're grieving everything that came before and everything that could have been. So I promised I was going to talk a little bit about grief theory, and I promise it won't be too cerebral, too heady. But before I get started, I've already heard a little bit from folks, but I'm curious, when you think about different grief theories or theorists, what is the first name or first theory that comes to mind? And I'll give you a hint. It's got a number in it. Yep, there we go. I heard it. 5 Stages of Grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So when I do these talks, almost inevitably somebody says, what about the 5 stages of grief? You haven't talked about that yet. And I take a deep breath and I brace myself because it's not what we think it is. So with that being said, I'm going to talk about Dr. Kubler-Ross and 5 stages of grief. So we all know the stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. What most people don't know is that Dr. Kubler-Ross created and wrote this theory for people who are dying. I'm gonna let that sink in for just a second. She wrote this theory for people who were dying. She didn't write it for people who are grieving. And grief, as we've been talking about, it's not linear, right? It doesn't have a clear start or clear end. It continues. It doesn't stop after death. And so if you think about, I'm going to put this under my shoulder for a second. If you think about a linear path, we're born, we live, we die. That's a linear path, right? So this is what we're thinking about. This is what that theory was written for. But we said grief doesn't end with death. We keep grieving. So what happens over here? What theory, what support, what understanding do we have for people who continue on after that death? So while we still talk about Dr. Kubler-Ross, her theory has merit, it wasn't written for us, right? I think this next slide does a good job of explaining what I mean by grief not being linear. It shows how we want grief to work, a clear start, a clear end. If we're lucky, maybe some helpful mile markers in between to let us know that we're going at the right pace, that the finish line is near. But in reality, it looks so much more like the image on the right. A clear start with the death, up and down and all over, and an arrow. It continues. It's a lifelong process. It looks more like if you've ever had a necklace that got tangled up, those tiny little knots that are impossible to untie. We know that the more we pull on them, the more that we push and pull, the more tangled they become, the tighter those knots become. It's in the suspension, it's in the intentional movements, the slowing down, that we're really able to untangle it and be able to make sense of what we're holding. And the same is true of grief. So you might be asking, okay, E, if you're taking away my 5 stages of grief, what is left for me? And there are a lot of theories about grief and understanding grief. Not all are created equal. But one that we most ascribe to at the Grief Center is William Worden's 4 Tasks of Mourning. And so obviously there are 4. But the beautiful thing about this is that they're not linear. You can work on multiple tasks at a time, and it allows us to support grievers wherever they are and however they are in their grief. And so, not particularly in this order, one is accepting the reality of the loss. That may sound silly if you have not grieved before, but again, as someone said earlier, how many times do we dial their number before we realize they're not going to pick up? That's often why a year or 2 years or 5 years after that loss, sometimes we see an uptick in grief symptoms, the further we get from that reality. 2 is processing the pain of grief. That's a lot of what we do in grief counseling, retelling stories, again, using that magnifying glass to create a narrative around what has happened. 3 is, adjusting to a new world without the person who's died. Again, we're living in 2 realities, one in which this person has always existed, and one in which this person no longer physically exists. And we're navigating how to do that. And finally, finding an enduring connection with the deceased while embarking on a new life. And we do that in a lot of ways. Maybe that's through talking to our person or creating rituals for connection. These are all things that we'll be talking about next. So again, that's William Worden's 4 Tasks of Mourning. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about holding grief for ourselves, for each other, and offer some practical tips. So caring for our own grief, I've separated in connect, talk, and tend. So with connect, again, knowing that love doesn't end with death. Our relationship, our connection to that person remains. We find ways to remain connected with our person through our memories, communication, rituals. There are a couple on campus in particular at Transitions that we have for expression and connection. One is called the Cosmic Post, where it's just a structure or a sculpture that was commissioned by a local artist, and it sounds exactly like what it is. It's a little post box made of metal, and we invite folks to write a letter, scribble, draw a picture, however you communicate. You drop it into the post office box, and there's a wick underneath where we light it, and it creates ash and smoke of your letter, your words, and it billows out through the top. And it's just this really beautiful, meaningful way of honoring that connection, of communicating to somebody who maybe no longer has a physical address. We also have a newly dedicated wind phone on campus, which is really beautiful. It's this little vestibule where you can sit down, and there is an old school, I think, rotary phone where you can sit down and pick up the phone. It's disconnected, and you can talk to your person. It overlooks NC State's pastures, far enough away from campus that Nobody's going to hear what you're saying. You can even scream. We did test that. You will not offend anybody or wake anybody up. But just two really beautiful opportunities specifically on campus that we have for connecting with your person. And being with supportive and comforting people. Someone once told me, you don't go to Home Depot to buy bread. And I think what they meant by that is if you need somebody to just listen or hold space, maybe you don't go to Uncle Wayne over here that just wants to crack jokes and distract you. But knowing what some of those needs might be and who some of those people are that you can call on to help meet some of those needs. Talking with grief, again, maybe a friend or a counselor. Would encourage any of you to reach out if we can be of support in any way. Again, we've got free grief support for adults at no charge. Some is in person, some is via Zoom so that you can access it from anywhere. Talking about the person who's died. You have the right to talk about your person, to say their name, to tell that story over and over and over again, and to find people who don't find you a burden, right? Those people are out there. I would encourage you to seek them out. And finally, tending, being aware of your physical or emotional limitations. You are not yourself when you're grieving. You're not at full capacity when you're grieving. So when the doctor tells you to exercise, maybe you don't go out and run a marathon. Maybe your exercise is just walking down the hall and back. So knowing your limitations, knowing what you need, eliminating unnecessary stress. Maybe this isn't the time to take up a new role or a hobby or volunteering for a new role. I have tried to teach my son this at a very young age, that no is a complete sentence, and sometimes he takes it a little too far. But what I mean by that is when you say no, it's a complete sentence. You don't have to give an excuse or an explanation. Be aware of your limitations and know that it's okay to say no. And finally, doing what feels right for you. There will be other people in your life, you've probably met them already, that have told you, when my husband died, I did this. Why don't you do this, right? There are so many ways to grieve and to cope with grief. Not every piece of advice or coping skill is going to resonate. It might not feel good for you. It's okay to put that down. See life and the guidance or support that people provide to you as a buffet, right? Take what is meaningful for you and leave everything else behind. I know several of you were talking about, I'm here because I'm grieving, but I also want to know, how do I support my family? How do I support my community, the people around me? And one thing that I always encourage folks to do is to not do much of anything except be there, right? Don't rush to fix. The book that I mentioned earlier, It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine, she says some things can't be fixed. They can only be carried. And grief is one of those things. And it's okay to ask. And there's an old proverb that says, a joy shared is doubled, a grief shared is halved. And you can help just by simply and genuinely acknowledging the loss and the pain, just by listening without judgment or haste to try to change it or make it better. And you may be afraid that speaking that person's name aloud is going to cause them pain. But in reality, that pain is already there. What you're doing is allowing some of that pain to be released. Again, that proverb, a joy shared is doubled, a grief shared is halved. And it's okay to feel awkward. When in doubt, listen. There are not necessarily right words in grief. There's a lot of wrong words to say, but there are no necessarily right words. But just listening communicates that you accept that person, however they are, wherever they are, and that you care for them. And your job, should you choose to accept it, is to feel awkward and stay there anyway. Lean into their pain. And when things get dark, and they may, that's okay. It's okay to let things be dark. You don't have to shine a bright light into every corner. And finally, listening and mirroring. Megan Devine, she talks about how good things and horrible things, they take up the same amount of space. They don't cancel each other out. She talks about sadness being a really healthy part of the grief process. And so being your neighbor's mirror, when they say something like, this is so hard, it's okay to say, yeah, this is really hard. That might sound like an oversimplification, but it can be such an incredible benefit and comfort to just have somebody who mirrors you and doesn't try to change however it is that you're feeling. I know I've been talking at you for quite a bit. I just want to pause and see if there are any questions, insights, things that have come up for you.
One thing I need to get, I couldn't get the name of the book.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so she was asking for the name of the book. It was It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And the author is Megan Devine. Megan Devine is her name. Yep. Excellent book. She writes it from the perspective of both a clinician as well as somebody who has experienced a traumatic death. Very accessible, very raw, excellently written. Yeah.
Not wanting to prolong the discussion, but one aspect of grief that you have not mentioned that was very important to me, because I had a spouse with a terminal illness, and I knew what was going to happen, was the anticipatory grief.
Absolutely.
Because in that particular case, you start grieving not the moment that they take the last breath, but you start grieving 2 weeks,
Yeah.
2 months, even 2 years before, because you know what the end result is actually going to be.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. And the reason I did not bring that up, because that's a whole other presentation conversation that I could talk on for a long while. But absolutely, when we know somebody is dying, sometimes we don't have that opportunity, right? They die suddenly or there's an accident. But when somebody has a prolonged illness, that anticipatory grief, and oftentimes, especially if there is dementia, we talk about it being two deaths, the death of the person, the things that made them who they were, and the physical person. And so with anticipatory grieving, we grieve people often in stages or in parts. And I think one of the misunderstandings about anticipatory grief is, gosh, I've been grieving this person all along. Why did this hit me so hard when they were physically gone? I knew this was coming. And the thing is, with anticipatory grief or grief in general, it's not a silo, right? We don't have a fixed amount of grief that we use up if we know it's coming. It's a process. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Anyone else? Other questions, comments, curiosities? We've got a little homework. If you want to bring it with you, you don't have to answer these now, but just some things to consider. One is, what inner resources do I have to cope with my grief? What strengths or qualities have always been a part of me, or have I gained, that can help me to rebuild this in this next chapter? And the second question is, what qualities do I have because my loved one existed? What did they call out in me? How did they challenge me to grow? What are some unique qualities about me that wouldn't exist if they hadn't been in my life? Next is, what's one thing I'd like to change? That may sound a little strange. We don't sit around waiting for our people to die. But sometimes, especially if we were caregivers, we put things on the back burner. Maybe it's tending to my own health. Maybe it's just saying I love you more. And the last one What's one thing that I've already been able to do that I didn't think was possible? No matter how small, even if it's just I got out of bed this morning. So again, just some things to chew on, some thoughts to marinate on. But I want to thank you all for allowing me to share this space with you all and lean into these really difficult topics. I just am so grateful for each of you for being here, for leaning into something that most people would run away screaming from. So thank you for your vulnerability, your honesty, your courage. Thanks for having me.